Miguel Torres watched his 6-year-old son Tommy approach yet another woman at the Central Park playground, his small hands clasped behind his back in the polite posture Miguel had taught him for meeting strangers. It was their third Sunday here this month, and Miguel's stomach clenched with familiar embarrassment as he quickened his pace to intervene before Tommy could ask the question that had been breaking Miguel's heart for weeks. "Excuse me," Tommy said to the dark-haired woman sitting alone on the bench, his voice carrying that particular mixture of hope and careful politeness that children master when they're asking for something they desperately want but have been told they probably can't have. "Would you like to be my mommy for just one day? My dad says I can't ask strangers, but you look really nice, and I promise I'm a good boy who says please and thank you and doesn't make messes." Miguel reached them just as the woman's face went completely white, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the bench like someone fighting off a panic attack. But instead of the rejection or uncomfortable dismissal Miguel expected, she looked at Tommy with an expression that was equal parts wonder and devastation, as if his innocent request had just shattered something she'd been carefully holding together for years. "Tommy, step back, please," Miguel said quickly, his protective instincts shifting into overdrive as he tried to assess whether this woman was having some kind of breakdown that might be dangerous for his son. But before he could pull Tommy away, the woman took a shuddering breath and whispered, "No one has ever asked me to be their mother before. Not even for pretend." The words came out broken, like she was confessing something shameful, and Miguel felt his prepared apology die in his throat as he realized this wasn't rejection or discomfort. This was a woman who had just been offered something she'd apparently never dared to hope for. There was something in her tone, a depth of longing and loss that made Miguel forget his embarrassment and protective anger, replacing them with an overwhelming urge to understand what could make a complete stranger react so powerfully to his son's innocent request. Tommy, with the emotional intuition that children possess, moved closer to the woman instead of away, his small face serious with concern. "Did I hurt your feelings? I didn't mean to make you look sad." The woman's composure cracked further at Tommy's gentle words, and she pressed her hands to her face while her shoulders shook with the force of emotions she was clearly struggling to contain. "You didn't hurt my feelings, sweetheart," she managed after a long moment, lowering her hands to reveal eyes that were red-rimmed but somehow lighter than they'd been before, as if Tommy's request had released some pressure she'd been carrying for too long. "You gave me something beautiful, and I just wasn't ready for it." Miguel found himself studying her with growing curiosity and unexpected sympathy, noting the expensive quality of her simple clothes and the careful way she composed herself, as if maintaining control was a skill she'd practiced extensively. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but still carried an undercurrent of vulnerability that made Miguel want to sit down beside her and demand to know who had hurt her badly enough to make a child's innocent request feel like both a gift and a wound. "I'm Elena," she said, extending her hand to Tommy with the kind of gravity usually reserved for important business meetings, and Miguel noticed that her fingers were still trembling slightly despite her attempts at composure. "And I think being a mommy for a day sounds like exactly what I need today, if your dad says it's okay." Miguel felt something fundamental shift in his chest as he watched his son's face transform with pure joy. But underneath his relief was a growing awareness that this woman's story was far more complicated than a simple chance encounter in the park. Elena spent the next 3 hours being the mother Tommy had been dreaming of, pushing him on the swings with the kind of focused attention that made other parents glance over with curiosity, helping him collect leaves for a nature project with enthusiasm that seemed genuine rather than forced, and listening to his elaborate explanations about dinosaurs and space travel with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Miguel found himself relaxing in a way he couldn't remember feeling since before his wife's accident, watching Elena navigate Tommy's endless questions and requests with natural grace, despite her obvious lack of recent experience with children. When Tommy scraped his knee on the playground equipment, Elena's immediate response was swift and competent, producing wet wipes and a bandage from her purse, with the efficiency of someone accustomed to handling minor crises, though her gentle murmur of comfort was pure maternal instinct. "There," she said, smoothing the edges of the bandage with careful fingers, "all better. Though I think this knee deserves some ice cream, don't you?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically, and Miguel felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his son lean into Elena's touch with the trust he'd been seeking for months. At the ice cream cart, Miguel insisted on paying despite Elena's protests, and he couldn't help but notice the quality of the credit card she'd attempted to use, Platinum, with a name that seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place why. As the afternoon wound down and other families began packing up their picnic blankets and corralling tired children, Miguel felt a familiar dread at the thought of returning to their quiet house, where Tommy's temporary joy would fade into the reality of their everyday routine. "This was the best day ever," Tommy announced, slipping his small hand into Elena's with the easy affection he'd shown her all afternoon. "Can you be my mommy for a day again next Sunday?" Elena looked at Miguel over Tommy's head, and he saw something vulnerable and hopeful in her expression that made him nod before he could second-guess the impulse. "If Elena doesn't mind," Miguel said carefully, "we come here most Sundays around noon." Elena's smile was radiant with relief and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. "I'd love that," she said simply. "Thank you for letting me be part of your day." As they exchanged phone numbers and made tentative plans for the following week, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted in their small world, though he couldn't have explained exactly what or why. That night, after Tommy had fallen asleep talking excitedly about Mommy Elena, Miguel found himself wondering about the woman who had reacted to his son's request with such profound emotion, and what kind of life she lived that made temporary motherhood feel like such a precious gift. The next Sunday, Elena arrived before they did, sitting on the same bench with a small cooler and an expression of nervous anticipation that made Miguel's chest warm with something he was careful not to name. Tommy spotted her immediately and broke into a run, calling Mommy Elena, with unself-conscious joy that made several nearby parents turn to look with curiosity and what Miguel hoped was approval rather than judgment. Elena caught Tommy in a hug that lifted him off his feet, spinning him around while laughing with delight that seemed to surprise her as much as it pleased Tommy. "I brought snacks," she said, setting Tommy down and opening the cooler to reveal an impressive array of cut fruit, homemade cookies, and juice boxes that put Miguel's usual offering of gas station snacks to shame. "And I thought maybe we could try the playground on the other side of the park today, if that's okay with your dad." Miguel found himself nodding agreement while studying Elena with growing curiosity about her life outside these Sunday afternoons, noting the way she dressed down in worn jeans and a simple t-shirt, but still managed to look polished in a way that spoke of underlying quality and attention to detail. Over the following weeks, their Sunday routine became the highlight of Miguel's week and the center of Tommy's universe, with Elena sliding into their lives with surprising ease despite the obvious care she took to maintain certain boundaries. She never mentioned her work beyond vague references to the office and meetings, never talked about her living situation or family, and always paid for treats and activities with cash rather than credit cards. Tommy, with the adaptability of childhood, accepted Elena's presence as a gift to be enjoyed rather than questioned, calling her Mommy Elena with increasing confidence and including her in his elaborate plans for future adventures, with the assumption that she would always be available for their Sunday outings. Miguel found himself looking forward to these afternoons with an intensity that both surprised and concerned him, catching himself thinking about Elena's laugh during his quiet evenings and wondering what she did with her time when she wasn't being a temporary mother to his son. There was something about her careful attention to Tommy, the way she listened to his stories with genuine interest and remembered details from week to week, that spoke of someone who had been starved for exactly this kind of simple, meaningful connection. One particularly warm Sunday in late September, Tommy convinced Elena and Miguel to join him in an elaborate game of pretend that involved rescuing dinosaurs from an imaginary volcano, and Miguel found himself lying on the grass beside Elena, while Tommy directed their escape with the serious intensity of a Hollywood director. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, her voice barely audible over Tommy's enthusiastic narration of their adventures. "For what?" Miguel asked, turning his head to study her profile as she watched Tommy with an expression of such tender concentration that it made Miguel's chest tight with emotion he wasn't ready to examine. "For letting me pretend to be normal," she said simply. "For letting me be part of this." There was something in her tone, a weight of loneliness and longing, that made Miguel want to ask questions he sensed she wasn't ready to answer, but Tommy's demanding return to their game prevented any deeper conversation. Later, as they walked to the ice cream cart that had become their traditional end to each Sunday afternoon, Miguel caught sight of Elena's reflection in a shop window and was struck by how different she looked from the woman he'd first met, more relaxed, more genuinely happy, as if these afternoons had been giving her something she'd been missing as much as they'd been giving Tommy what he needed. The bubble of their perfect routine burst on a crisp October Sunday when Elena arrived 20 minutes late, slightly out of breath and wearing clothes that Miguel immediately recognized as expensive despite their casual styling. "Sorry," she said breathlessly, accepting Tommy's enthusiastic hug while avoiding Miguel's questioning gaze. I got held up at work. Tommy, oblivious to any tension, launched immediately into a detailed account of his week at school. But Miguel found himself studying Elena with new attention, noting the way she kept checking her phone and the subtle tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there in previous weeks. When her phone rang during lunch, Elena glanced at the screen and her face went pale before she quickly declined the call, but not before Miguel caught a glimpse of a name that made his stomach drop with sudden understanding. Elena Chen, the caller ID had read, and Miguel felt the world shift around him as puzzle pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Elena Chen, the billionaire CEO whose face had been on magazine covers for her company's revolutionary technology deals. Elena Chen, whose personal life was famously private but whose professional achievements had made her one of the youngest female executives to crack the Fortune 500 list. "You're Elena Chen," Miguel said quietly while Tommy played on the nearby swings, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and something that felt uncomfortably like betrayal. Elena's shoulders sagged with defeat, and when she looked at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears and something that looked remarkably like relief. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." Miguel felt anger rise in his chest, hot and immediate, as he thought about the weeks of careful pretense and the way she'd inserted herself into their lives under false pretenses. So this has all been what, exactly? Some kind of charity work? A way to feel good about yourself by playing house with the poor single dad and his kid? Elena flinched as if he'd struck her, and Miguel immediately regretted the harshness of his words even as he couldn't take them back. "No," she said fiercely, her composure cracking completely. "Miguel, it started as. I don't know what it started as, but it became the most real thing in my life. These Sundays with you and Tommy are the only time I feel like myself instead of some corporate machine that makes money and cuts deals and never gets to just be human." Tommy chose that moment to run back to them, his face flushed with excitement and oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. "Mommy Elena, are you crying? Did you hurt yourself?" Elena gathered Tommy into her arms with desperate tenderness, and Miguel felt his anger complicate with sympathy as he watched her struggle to maintain composure for his son's sake. The truth came out in fragments over the next hour, with Elena explaining between Tommy's requests for attention and Miguel's carefully controlled questions. She'd taken a leave of absence from her company 6 months ago, burned out and isolated after years of building an empire that had cost her every meaningful relationship in her life. She'd been wandering through Central Park on Sundays, watching families with the kind of longing she'd never allowed herself to acknowledge, when Tommy had first approached her with his innocent request for a temporary mother. "I know how this looks," she said quietly while Tommy built elaborate sandcastles in the playground sandbox. "I know you must think I'm some kind of predator or weirdo who gets off on deceiving people. But Miguel, I swear to you, everything I've felt with you and Tommy has been real. More real than anything in my life." Miguel wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to the righteous indignation that felt safer than the complicated mix of understanding and attraction and terror that was threatening to overwhelm him. But watching Elena with Tommy, seeing the genuine tears in her eyes when she talked about how much these afternoons meant to her, he found his anger dissolving into something more complex and harder to define. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" he asked finally. "Because," Elena said simply, "for the first time in my adult life, someone looked at me and saw Elena who makes Tommy laugh, not Elena Chen who runs a billion-dollar company. And I was selfish enough to want to keep that feeling for as long as possible." Their fragile reconciliation was shattered 3 weeks later when Miguel arrived at the park to find Elena surrounded by news vans and reporters, her face pale with shock as cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward her. Tommy hung back uncertainly, clearly frightened by the chaos, and Miguel immediately swept him into his arms while pushing through the crowd toward Elena. "Miss Chen," a reporter shouted, "is it true that your board of directors has filed an emergency injunction to force your return? What do you say to employees who claim your absence has put their jobs at risk?" Elena looked directly into the camera with the kind of composure that had made her legendary in boardrooms, but Miguel could see the tremor in her hands as she spoke. "I have no comment at this time," she said firmly, then turned toward Miguel and Tommy with an expression of such raw vulnerability that it took his breath away. "I'm sorry," she whispered as they reached her. "I never wanted this to touch you." But it was too late. Photographers were already snapping pictures of Miguel and Tommy, and he realized with sinking horror that they were about to become part of whatever story was unfolding around Elena's corporate crisis. A second reporter pushed forward aggressively, shoving a microphone toward Tommy's face. "Little boy, Do you know that your friend is worth billions of dollars? How does it feel to play with someone so rich? Miguel felt rage explode in his chest as Tommy shrank back in confusion and fear, and without thinking he stepped forward to shield his son while snarling, "Get that camera away from my child or I'll break it myself." The full scope of the disaster became clear over the next 24 hours as news broke that Elena's board of directors had initiated legal proceedings to have her declared mentally incompetent and force her return to active leadership. Financial analysts were calling her absence a dereliction of fiduciary duty, and stock prices had plummeted by 40% as investors panicked about the company's stability without its visionary leader. Miguel found himself glued to financial news channels he'd never watched before, trying to understand how the woman who made dinosaur pancakes with his son could also be responsible for billions of dollars in market value and thousands of jobs hanging in the balance. The media coverage was relentless and cruel, with talking heads speculating about Elena's mental health and questioning whether a woman who abandoned her responsibilities to play house with strangers was fit to run a major corporation. "Daddy," Tommy said during breakfast, looking up from his cereal with the kind of serious expression that meant he was processing something important. "Why are those people on television saying mean things about Mommy Elena? She's not crazy like they said." Miguel felt his chest tighten as he realized that their carefully constructed bubble of normalcy had been permanently punctured, that Tommy would now have to navigate the complicated reality of loving someone who existed in a world far beyond their small family unit. Elena didn't come to the park that Sunday, or the next, and Miguel found himself torn between relief at avoiding the media circus and genuine worry about what her absence was doing to Tommy's fragile sense of security. His son asked about Mommy Elena dozens of times each day, his questions growing more plaintive as the weeks passed without explanation or contact. Miguel tried calling the number Elena had given him, but it went straight to an automated message saying the number was no longer in service, and he wondered if she'd been forced to change everything about her life to escape the media attention. The uncertainty was killing him slowly, but it was Tommy's quiet acceptance of Elena's disappearance that broke his heart completely, the way his son stopped asking when she was coming back and instead began talking about her in the past tense, as if he'd already learned at 6 years old that people he loved could simply vanish without warning or explanation. Miguel felt rage building in his chest, not at Elena for being who she was, but at the system that had trapped her in a life where love and human connection had to be sacrificed on the altar of corporate responsibility and shareholder value. He found himself checking financial news obsessively, looking for any sign of what was happening to Elena, and felt sick when he saw headlines about her being under medical supervision and receiving treatment for stress-related breakdown. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening 3 weeks later when Miguel answered his door to find Elena standing on his front porch, soaked to the skin and shivering despite the expensive coat that hung like a shroud around her shoulders. She looked like she'd lost 15 pounds and aged 10 years, her face gaunt and her eyes holding the hollow quality of someone who had been pushed beyond their breaking point and somehow found the strength to keep going. "I quit," she said without preamble, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "I signed the papers 2 hours ago and walked out of the building for the last time. I'm done." Miguel stared at her for a long moment, taking in the shadows under her eyes and the way her hands were shaking, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest as he realized she'd chosen them over everything else in her life. "Elena," he said quietly, stepping aside to let her into the warmth of their small house. "What does that mean? Are you okay? What about the company?" She laughed then, a sound that was equal parts hysteria and liberation, and Miguel caught her as her knees buckled slightly with the exhaustion of someone who had been running on pure willpower for too long. "It means I told them all to go to hell," she whispered against his shoulder. "The board, the lawyers, the shareholders who think they own me, I told them I'd rather destroy everything than spend one more day being their prisoner." Tommy appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and when he saw Elena, his face lit up with pure joy. "Mommy Elena," he called, racing down the stairs and launching himself into her arms with the complete trust of a child who had never doubted that the people he loved would eventually come home. The full story emerged over the next several hours, as Elena sat curled up on Miguel's couch, with Tommy pressed against her side, both of them clinging to each other with the desperate relief of reunion after enforced separation. She'd spent 3 weeks in what amounted to corporate captivity, surrounded by lawyers and doctors and board members who had tried every form of pressure and manipulation to force her back into compliance. They'd threatened her with financial ruin, legal action, and public humiliation, But Elena had finally played her ace, card threatening to go public with evidence of illegal corporate practices that would destroy the company entirely if they didn't accept her resignation and leave her alone. I told them I'd do interviews with every major network, write a tell-all book, whatever it took to make sure the world knew what their definition of success had cost me, she said quietly, her fingers automatically stroking Tommy's hair as he dozed against her shoulder. Funny how quickly they found an acceptable exit strategy once they realized I was serious about burning it all down on my way out. Miguel felt a surge of fierce pride at Elena's courage in choosing their small family over the empire she'd spent years building, but he also understood the magnitude of what she'd sacrificed and the uncertainty that lay ahead for all of them. "What happens now?" he asked as they sat together in the quiet hours after midnight. Tommy finally asleep in his own bed and Elena wrapped in one of Miguel's old sweatshirts that made her look young and vulnerable in a way her corporate attire never had. "I have enough money to last several lifetimes, even after the legal settlement," Elena said with a pragmatism that spoke of someone who had always understood the mathematics of wealth and security. "But more importantly, I have you and Tommy, if you'll still have me after everything I've put you through." Miguel studied her face in the soft lamplight, noting the way freedom had already begun to soften the sharp edges of stress and corporate responsibility that had defined her features during those last few weeks of crisis. "Elena," he said carefully, "you walked away from a $3 billion empire. For us, I'm not sure how to process that or what it means for the future." Elena reached for his hand with the tentative gesture of someone who was no longer certain of her welcome, and Miguel felt his heart break a little at the vulnerability in her touch. "It means I finally figured out the difference between having everything and having what matters," she said simply. "And you and Tommy matter more than all the rest of it combined." Miguel lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, while silently marveling at the courage it must have taken for her to blow up her entire life for the chance to build something real with them. "Then we figure it out together," he said quietly. "All of it. The media attention, the money, the fact that Tommy's temporary mommy turned out to be one of the most powerful women in America. We figure it out because we're a family now, and families don't abandon each other when things get complicated." Elena's tears came freely then, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow, and as Miguel pulled her into his arms, he realized that sometimes the most profound love stories began, not with grand romantic gestures, but with a child's innocent request for temporary motherhood and a lonely woman's decision to say yes. The media attention died down gradually over the following months, as other corporate scandals captured public interest. But the transformation in Elena was immediate and profound. She threw herself into domestic life with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new country, learning to cook Tommy's favorite meals and helping Miguel with household projects, and navigating the complex social dynamics of elementary school parent groups. Miguel watched her shed the armor of corporate success layer by layer, revealing the woman underneath who had been buried for so long under expectations and responsibilities that she'd almost forgotten she existed. Tommy, with the resilience of childhood, accepted Elena's permanent presence in their lives as a gift to be celebrated rather than questioned, including her in his bedtime prayers and school projects and elaborate plans for future adventures with the assumption that she would always be there to help make his dreams come true. The three of them settled into routines that felt both revolutionary and utterly natural: Saturday morning pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, evening walks through their neighborhood, quiet Sunday afternoons in the park where their story had begun. 6 months after Elena's dramatic resignation, they were married in a simple ceremony in Miguel's backyard, surrounded by the small community of friends and neighbors who had watched their unconventional romance unfold with approval and genuine affection. Elena wore a simple white dress that she'd bought off the rack at a department store, delighting in the ordinary pleasure of choosing something for its beauty rather than its appropriateness for corporate meetings, and Miguel felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched her walk down their makeshift aisle with Tommy at her side instead of a traditional father figure. Their vows were brief and practical rather than flowery, focusing on the ordinary promises of daily partnership and mutual support that had already been tested through months of shared parenting and domestic challenges. But when Elena promised to love Tommy as fiercely as if she'd given birth to him herself, there wasn't a dry eye among their small gathering of witnesses. The reception was held in their living room with homemade food and music from Miguel's old stereo system, and as Elena danced with Tommy to a song about being brave and kind, Miguel realized that they had built something infinitely more valuable than any corporate Empiria family, bound together by choice rather than obligation, by love rather than duty. Sometimes the most profound changes began with the smallest gestures: a lonely child asking a stranger to be his mother for a day, a successful woman choosing human connection over corporate achievement, a widowed father deciding to trust his heart despite its previous injuries. Elena had taught him that wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the number of people who were genuinely glad to see you come home each night, and Tommy had shown them both that love was always expandable rather than finite, growing stronger when shared rather than diminished by division among multiple recipients. As they sat together in the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed words to communicate their essential thoughts and feelings, Miguel felt the deep peace that came from knowing that they had built something worth protecting and sharing, something that would outlast their individual lives, in the form of the children they raised, and the community they created, and the simple but radical example they provided of what was possible when people chose connection over isolation, love over fear, and presence over productivity as their primary measures of success.